Good. Thank you very much, Jean-Jacques. Thanks for recalling the time I took your students to Megiddo in a giant thunderstorm. They were amazing. And as it happens, just last week or a week and a half ago, I took another group of Roman Catholic priest students from St. Louis, Missouri, and it was also a huge thunderstorm at Megiddo. But they were very weak. The Dominicans persevered much better. Okay, good. Thank you for welcoming me here. Today I'll be talking about our excavations at Legio. On behalf of my colleagues Yotam Tepper and Susan Cohen, I did bring a picture of them. There they are on the left. The three of us are direct excavations there, now in our 4th season. On the right you can see our latest crop of students from the summer of 2019, which you'll be hearing a lot about. This is the first time that we're speaking about the results of those excavations. So I'll start with a little bit of background, talk about our first 3 seasons, which are of course very exciting, and then I'll get to this season as well. Necessarily I'll be leaving a lot out, but if there's anything you want to focus in on during the question period, of course I'm happy to discuss it. But first, we have to start with the Bible, yeah? I put the word Armageddon in the title, so I feel I owe it to you to talk a little bit about it. I'll start by referring to this passage here, and then I will completely ignore it until we come to the end, and then I will have some other comments to say about it. So, of course, the word Armageddon comes from one passage. It's a hapax in the New Testament book of Revelation, chapter 16, verse 16, and I will read it for you in my best Bible voice. The 6th angel poured his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up in order to prepare the way for the kings from the east. And I saw 3 foul spirits like frogs coming from the mouth of the dragon and the mouth of the beast and from the mouth of the false prophet. These are demonic spirits performing signs who go abroad to the kings of the whole world to assemble them for battle on the great day of God the Almighty. And they assembled them at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Now, as many of you know, this word Armageddon comes from, it's a corruption of the Greek, of the Hebrew, Har Megiddo, meaning Mount Megiddo. And for a long time, this word was understood to be referring to the place Megiddo. And so we'll start our journey off at Megiddo and then wind our way to the Roman legionary base and then try to understand why the author of Revelation might place these apocalyptic visions at the site that we are referring to. Hopefully you all know where we are, and I can zoom in, of course, to the Jezreel Valley, into the area of Megiddo. I hope many of you, I should warn you that we have a very sensitive device here, so I'll probably do that a lot. Zooming into Megiddo, which is, of course, one of the dominant sites in the Jezreel Valley, about an hour and a half to the north of us. On your right-hand side, you see the site of Megiddo, which is here. It's primarily known as a tell site, as we will see, but it is a much bigger site than that, as we will see in the coming slides. I can do it. Here we go. Good. Here is the tell itself, which is very well known as a national park site. This is the site that I led the Dominicans to a couple of years ago. It is primarily a Bronze and Iron Age site itself. It is very well excavated and one of the best known Bronze and Iron Age sites in the region, well known from the excavations of the University of Chicago and the ongoing excavations by the joint American and Tel Aviv University team to this day. Now, in addition to the Bronze and Iron Age remains, Greek and Roman sources refer to 3 other important sites that somehow are in the region of Megiddo. A Jewish village known as Kfar Odnai or Kaprakotani in the Greek, a Roman legionary base which is referred to as Legio, especially by Eusebius of Caesarea. Other texts slightly later help us to understand that at first the 2nd Triana Legion had shown up there in the early 2nd century and spent only a very small amount of time before the Roman 6th Ferrata Legion showed up sometime between, say, 117 and 132. The exact dating of the arrival is not clear, and then depart sometime in the late 3rd, early 4th century. Other texts refer to a Byzantine city of Maximianopolis, named for one of the Caesars, the co-emperors of Constantine. Later sources from the Islamic and Ottoman periods refer to a site of Legion in this area, which clearly takes its name from Legio, the Latin word for the area. Our focus, of course, today is on the Roman Legionary base, and thanks to almost a century, or even more than a century of scholarship, we have a pretty good idea, generally, of where a lot of these toponyms might be located in the landscape. Here are some of the folks that were involved in that, and I'll go through some of those discoveries to give you a sense of how we got to choose our location for excavation. The earliest work here was done by Gottlieb Schumacher, who many of you are familiar with. He was here in 1902, 1903, and was working primarily on Tel Megiddo. He butchered that site, but he did give us a lot of information on the surrounding area. He produced this map on the left, which has Tel Megiddo on the north side, but in red marking a lot of ancient remains that he found on the surface. And he is the last witness to most of the remains on this site. Within about a decade or two, large-scale farming, and then within 40 years, industrial-scale farming obliterated most of these things. So his survey remains a very valuable testimony to some of the material that was there, even if he doesn't really describe it very well. Some of the things that he and contemporaries photographed in nearby villages, here showing you the southern end of his survey map, include Roman and Byzantine columns, later Crusader crosses, columns in situ in what is now the kibbutz of Tel Megiddo, probably representing one of the main streets of the Byzantine city. All of this no longer visible today. From the nearby field south of Megiddo, which is known by Schumacher as the Hill of El-Manach, a number of finds have been produced over the years by various surveys, by salvage excavations, and by local people roaming around and rooting things out after a nice heavy rain, including this lion that you see here. Anybody recognize this lion? This lion is now at the Rockefeller Museum with a nice tube coming out of its mouth in the pool there. So so go see it. It's very nice. Roman cremation burials. Also, during the construction of what is now known as the Megiddo Prison. It's working? Okay. Thank you. We're going to switch here. During the construction of the Megiddo Prison, which was a British Mandate-era police station, salvage excavations, which the results of which only recently came to light in the IAA archives, produced a number of finds from the Roman and Byzantine period, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, including this stone door, which is similar to stone tomb doors from nearby Beit Shearim, this one with a Samaritan inscription referencing this guy, Ephraim Bar Shimon. Kfar Odnai, the Jewish village, is relatively well known in rabbinic sources as a village of Samaritan settlers. Other surveys that were conducted, in particular by my colleague Yotam, in the area produced a lot of Roman 2nd and 3rd century pottery, Roman drain pipes, and fortunately for him, one piece of a Roman roof tile with a stamp of the Roman 6th Legion on it. Somewhat later after his surveys, in 2005 to be exact, Yotam was invited by the Antiquities Authority to conduct salvage excavations at the prison area, and many of you have probably heard of some of his results before. They included quite a number of excavations, but the most famous includes the excavation of this particular building, which at first was thought to be a private villa, but later understood as a more public structure, which had a public access room in the back with a mosaic. Let me zoom in on the mosaic for you. The mosaic is now famous. It dates to the 3rd century somewhere based on coins and other finds from the building itself. It has 3 very important pieces of information in it. One is the dedication of part of this mosaic to 3 women. Another is this part of the inscription, which I will read for you. Gaianus, also called Peripherus, centurion, so Roman army officer, our brother has made this pavement at his own expense as an act of liberality. And then Brutius carried out the work. And most importantly and most famously, the God-loving Akeptus has offered the table, referring probably to this structure here, to God, Jesus Christ, as a memorial. So the earliest archaeological attestation of this divine figure, along with one of his earliest symbols, the fishes. Good. A lot of Roman milestones have been found in the Galilee area, many of them referring to the site of Legio as the point from which the miles were counted. Enough of these have been put together to be able to triangulate back to the region of Megiddo and roughly approximate where the Roman legionary base might be located. So this is another very important piece of evidence that, taken together with all of the other things that have been found over the last century plus, suggested to some of my colleagues that perhaps the legionary base is located here. And this was our point of departure, and the beginning of our excavations was to test the hypothesis that this large open field south of the Tell of Megiddo might hold the Roman legionary base. Good. I'm just going to skip a few here. What might a Roman legionary base look like? Well, this is actually a very good question. For those of you who might be from Western Europe, it might be part of your popular culture to know what these bases look like, because they are very well excavated in Germany and France and England. You can't go very far along a highway before you get to some national park to stop and visit a Roman legionary base. So these are very well known and very well documented in the western half of the empire. They also have chronological markers. They look very specific in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries CE. Then they look in slightly earlier periods, and for sure, then they look after the reign of Diocletian and Constantine, during which time the morphology of these bases and the deployment of the Roman army was changed significantly. So in short, what we're looking at here on the left-hand side is a fabulous example from Germany of what a 1st, 2nd, 3rd century base might look like. Or in fact, what they do look like, obviously, in Germany and Europe. And they all have a lot of the same characteristics. You see a couple of examples on your right as well. They're all rectangular in shape. I should stipulate that I'm talking about full-scale legionary bases. That is the deployment of a full legion of about 5,000 or 6,000 soldiers and everything that goes with them. There are, of course, smaller forts and other things where you could have small detachments, and that's not what we're talking about here. Full legions. Rectangular in shape. In this case, we're talking about 300 or 400 meters wide in this direction by 400 or 500 meters in this direction. So they're huge virtual cities. They're always surrounded by a fortification wall made of different types of materials depending on local supply, surrounded by a series of ditches. Sometimes they may have held water, but usually they had spikes put in them so that bad guys would, of course, get impaled on them, which Romans love. Inside, there are 4 main gates, one along the central long axis, and then another along an axis which is 1/3 of the way across the long side. So this is very typical and conforms to Roman metrological standards. The main street running along this direction is called the Via Principia and is essentially the main street. It would be the equivalent of the Cardo in a Roman city. The main street running in this direction would be equivalent to the Decumanus in a Roman city as well. This long street is usually broken by a series of buildings, 2 actually. One, the main headquarters building, here marked in 1, which we will talk about in more detail a little bit later. I can't find any matching places. Siri. Did you get that on tape? Good. One is the main headquarters building called the Principia, which I'll spend some time on later. It has been the focus of our excavations. And another marked 13 here is the Praetorian, which is the commander's villa, which I won't really say much about. Okay, so here's the field in question. As I said, just south of Megiddo. You can see that it's still farmed today. They grow 2 or 3 crops a year, and so we try to slide in when we can to do our excavation. It looks pretty nondescript, but this is a satellite image, by the way. But you can already start to see that something fishy is going on here. You can see a long line here and a long line here. And if you're really clever or look at other satellite imagery, you might see a line here and possibly a line here, a large rectangle on the ground. This hadn't really been noticed before until we started to look through various pieces of aerial imagery and to process some of the data relating to them. In this case, you're looking at LiDAR data, which is giving microtopography, and then pulling out all of the noise so you can see a large rectangular structure here. And trust me, this is about 350 meters from here to here and about 450 from here to here. So if we had just taken, we didn't actually start looking at this imagery until we started excavation, but I put it ahead of time anyway. We also, at some point after our first season, started doing regular drone flights to map crop marks. And this one isn't very good. I think there's another image coming up very shortly. But if you were able to zoom in, you would see that there are all sorts of indications of walls in this field as well, including this large line here, which you already saw in the last image. So we've now conducted 4 seasons of excavation along with some extra remote sensing work. In particular, in 3 particular areas, Area A, B, and C. I'll talk about Area A first because that was our first excavation season. And those 4 seasons have now helped us to understand, in general, the overall layout of the camp. And the first thing that I can confirm for you right now is that a camp here at Legio is virtually identical with those discovered in Western Europe. And that is significant because this turns out to be the first excavated Roman legionary base in the period in question ever excavated in the Eastern Empire. So up to this point, it wasn't exactly clear if the Eastern Empire had its military deployed in the same ways and so forth. And there were a lot of reasons to question that based on how the provinces were formed and so forth, we won't dwell on. Good. So here we're starting in Area A. We're now high above Tel Megiddo, looking southward toward the modern-day prison where the early Christian prayer hall was discovered. In our first attempt, we spent 2 weeks. We didn't really intend at the time to make this a long-term project. We wanted to test the hypothesis that there might be a legionary base here, and we were working on other things as well. So we spent 2 weeks after another project and did a nice line of excavations. It's about 100 meters worth of 5 by 5 meter squares. It's also a good chance to see some of the topography that you've only seen from aerial images now, top down anyway. That line that represents the north side of the base, this line here, is the one you see in the foreground here. And you can see that it forms a line because of the shadow of this long trench. And the trench on the south side, which forms the south line, is over here. So our first goal was just to check different parts of the topography, the deepest part of this trench going up the slope into the theoretical center of the legionary base. And I will tell you, this was the easiest excavation anyone has ever done. On the first day of excavation, we had our answer. We probably should have stopped. Before I move on, we'll see some closer images shortly, but see how shallow all of the architecture is here. Like literally one sweep of a brush revealed a wall, and next to it, Roman scale armor and roof tiles with the name of the legion stamped on it. So I'm not joking when it was the first day. Okay, so here's that sequence of squares on the plan here. There we go. I'll turn it sideways for you. So to your right is north, and I'll just point out a couple of features that were obvious to us right away that really helped us seal the deal that, yes, this is a Roman legionary base, and yes, it very likely was the size and shape of what we would expect in the Western Empire. So on the north side, this trench here, and I'll just move forward one more, and just upslope from it, the foundations of a large wall, which is about 8 meters wide, that taken together form the typical fortification style for any of these bases. That is a large, thick fortification wall. Downslope is a human dug trench or fosse or moat or whatever you'd like to call it. And I got it. It was going to be dramatic. Now it's all messed up. And inside the bottom of the trench was an extra V-shaped trench, which was cut out, presumably, for large spikes, like this hypothetical example, which is constructed from excavations in the UK. So we had our fortifications. We had evidence of water pipes, which are classic Roman, especially in this period. We had otherwise excavated a series, small window into other structures, which were probably barracks buildings. I'll come back to that in just a moment, that were separated by alleyways, which were carved right into the bedrock of the site, alleyways which also had carved into them Roman-style sewers, and so forth. A majority of the finds that we have from Legio are roof tiles. There are tons and tons and tons of roof tiles. We have an entire container that is completely full of roof tiles because we have this great idea that if we just save all of them, we can do something with them. And one day I will tell you what that is. But here's what they look like. Here's how they work. They're made up of these trays with curving pieces, not dissimilar to what is often used today. But we have lots of these. We have lots of them not just because all of the buildings were covered with roof tiles and they collapsed inside of the buildings. No, it appears that at the end of the life of the camp, when the Roman army was redeployed, and I'll come back to when a little bit later, they dismantled the entire base, crushed up all the roof tiles, and put them as a single layer across the entire site. Which is great because it's a very nice datum for us during excavation. We know when we're in a room, we know where the final event was, and underneath we usually find a little bit more garbage, and then if we're lucky, some things left behind. It turns out the Roman soldiers were extremely neat, and in this case did not leave a lot of stuff behind. It also makes it easier to publish, I suppose. Several of these tiles had the stamp of the legion. In this case, the Legio Six Ferrata, L-E-G, Roman numeral V-I, and then F-E-R-R, which is the name of the legion. Some other finds, just some random things for you to give you that sense of, oh yeah, this is a Roman site, and oh yeah, this is a Roman army site. Things like these Medusa heads or whatever they are for the edges of the roof. Lots of oil lamps, scale armor, coins, of course, many of the coins bearing the counter marks of the Roman Sixth Legion. You can't mess the identification up here. Some nice pieces, a panther or feline table leg. This is an example. This is our reconstruction based on an example from Pompeii. And even a dead soldier himself buried underneath one of the barracks in a hollowed out cave, cremated, of course, in the Roman style, inside of a cooking pot, and here's what's left of him. Good. So that was our first 2-week season. We felt like we had everything down. There were a few open questions. There was still a possibility that the size and shape of the base, there were a couple of different options that we had, but that was all cleared up very easily over the next couple of seasons. So I'll summarize the next 3 seasons kind of all as one package here. Because we focused primarily on the center of the camp, you see B and C, they look like 2 different excavation areas, and in fact they are in all logistical senses, but they are in fact excavating 2 different corners of the same building, one very large building, the Principia or headquarters of the base. Meanwhile, while all this excavation is taking place, we're also conducting a ground-penetrating radar and magnetometer survey, which is still in process. This is the latest results, which have covered the very center of the camp. Here you see our areas B and C we're about to go to now, but you can see the high level of detail of remains that we have at the site. We're now going to zoom in to this insula here, which is the Principia. Here we go. Areas B and C. At the end of these excavations, actually now 2 years ago, we commissioned an artist to put together this for you, so hopefully a lot of what you just saw and what you will see is now come alive. It's a little bit schematic, but it does give you a general idea of what we're dealing with here. You see that a majority of the camp is filled with barracks. There's probably more barracks here than there should be. And at the center of the camp is the Principia headquarters and the Praetorian commander's residence. the gates that we've been discussing, and so forth. And for those of you Bronze and Iron Age people, Tel Megiddo is back here. Just a little blip in this massive Roman site. Okay, now, our excavations in areas B and C have given us enough pieces of the base that we feel very confident in reconstructing the overall dimensions and layout of the structure because the Romans were so regular, especially in these periods, during the construction of these things. So we can say with some confidence that we know where the main street is and where the secondary street is, where they come together, and how they interact with the main headquarters building. More than you need to know. The size of the headquarters is here for you, 72 meters along the main Via Principia and 90 meters in depth, which is typical of the larger size headquarters in other parts of the empire. Here you see a few examples, one from the site of Novi in Bulgaria, which gives you a general sense of what these look like in 3 dimensions. And especially the plan of the Principia in Lambesis in Algeria, which is very much an ideal comparison for Legio. So you will see this plan over and over and over again over the next several slides. Some basic components. We typically have a large open courtyard, which is surrounded on 3 sides by a covered roofed portico. Rooms along the sides, the function of which is not exactly clear. Most scholars would suggest that these are storage facilities for arms and other things related to the functioning of the army. At one end of the open courtyard, you have a large raised podium, which is for commanders and officers to address troops that would be gathered here. It doesn't look that big, but various nerdy people have calculated how many soldiers could stand in formation here, and you could fit 5,000 soldiers, apparently. Beyond the platform, behind it is a series of rooms that were somehow offices related to the administration of the building, and especially in the dead center along the main axis, the most important room, the Sacellum, which was the equivalent of a temple for the Roman army. This is where the standards of the legion were kept, where the main Eagle standard would have been kept, along with 50 or 60 other standards relating to smaller units in the army. This is where the treasury was. And this is also where the statue of the emperor and or Jupiter would have been placed. So this is very much the sacred heart of the Roman base. Okay, so back to our plan. I'm now going to take our plans of areas B and C and twist them around for you in this orientation so that they match what you've seen already. So now we have B over here showing our excavations and C over here. There we go. And I will put it alongside the example of Lambesis to give you an idea. They're roughly the same size, and in fact, they have a lot in common. Area C is focused on the front part of the Principia, the main street, and the rooms along the side and part of the portico, as we'll see. And Area B has focused on the rear part, including the offices in one corner anyway, and this summer we've now moved to the Sacellum as well, which is very exciting, and you'll see. Okay, let's start with Area C, and we can zoom into the center where our excavations have excavated not only part of the Principia itself, but also part of the main street, which we can reconstruct like this for you, including parts of columns along the edge and the substructure of the street, as well as, if you look very closely down the center of the street, the remains of the main sewer. The remains here are not very glamorous. If you go to Europe, go to Germany, go to Carnuntum and see some really impressive things. Here, most of the stone has been robbed away. And Schumacher, already in 1902, was lamenting in his introduction how as he was excavating at Megiddo, the villagers from a nearby village of el-Fahim were coming and taking stone out by the donkey cart load on a daily basis. So we're lucky to have what we have. You know, these streets may have been paved with beautiful stones before. The sewers were probably lined with stone and capped with stone. You can imagine the wonderful street at Beit Shan, but you can barely tell that today. So we're dealing with substructures and other things as well. We are lucky in the sense that as you may have noticed from the topography, the camp is built on a slight hill. And what the Romans did is create where they would have, what do you call them? Like city blocks, where the streets would intersect. The parts downhill, they would build up walls, and the parts uphill, they would cut down in the bedrock, and the rear parts of these blocks would actually be carved out of the bedrock, which couldn't be carted away. So we have really good preservation as we go uphill, as we'll see in just a moment. In fact, walls preserved 2 or even 3 meters high because they're carved out of bedrock, versus the places downhill, which our preservation is 20, 30 centimeters, if we're lucky. Good. So let's go now to the main gate to the Principia. And here you get a sense of the preservation as well. Some of the large gate piers here and here, which are here and here, along with the threshold and the door socket leading to our left here or up into the gateway this way. It was probably a tripartite gate. This is an extreme example from Jerash, but it kind of gives you a sense of what this might have looked like in its glory on a much smaller scale. Good. Some of the finds from the gate area, again, there's not a lot left behind. We have pieces of inscriptions, pieces of theater masks, which often decorated the entrances to monumental structures, and other interesting floral motifs and so forth. Once you went inside the gate, you would still be in the portico before you passed into the main courtyard here. So you're in here, about to head here, and you see the remains of a stylobate, which formed part of the colonnade for the portico, which we can now zoom out to one of our aerial photographs from the end of last season. We were just here, and we could follow that stylobate now through excavation all the way to the corner before it turns in the other direction. And this summer we focused in on this area, which was of course the corner of the Principia, and were able to clarify the architecture related to, as in Lambesis here, the storage rooms and the portico. Good. Almost no finds here. We really just have architectural remains, but it was crucial for us to get this because this gave us one entire corner of the building, which allowed us to verify our overall dimensions and to create a mirror image of our reconstruction on the other side and really just kind of tie everything together. But it is very similar to the Lambesis model here. Good. Come on. All right, now moving back to Area B, which is a little bit more exciting. You can see that we've excavated 2 separate sections here. One is the opposite corner of the front corner that we just looked at, which is we'll look at in just a moment, and the other is the at least part of the Sacellum, which we'll come to at the end. Okay, aerial photograph of those 2 areas as they are today, our fresh excavations from the summer and our work over the last couple of years previous to that. Zooming in now in the corner. The Principia was surrounded on all sides by a paved street, and part of that excavation revealed part of that street, but as I said before, we don't have the capping stones. Instead, what we find is what was underneath the streets, which in this case was a lot of the infrastructure. We get tons of water pipes, sewage channels, and so forth. Zooming in. Okay, let me take you room by room for a moment. Most of the rooms in these military bases, the function is not exactly clear. In a few cases like Lambesis and in a couple of examples from Germany, we do have a little bit of graffiti that seems to suggest that these were offices for certain colleges within the Roman legion. Some suggest other activity, some suggest cultic activity, some seem to be multi-purpose. We had hoped to add to that information, and to some extent we have, although I wouldn't be extremely certain. Starting with what we were calling Room A in the far back corner, we have this amazing 20-centimeter thick solid concrete floor, which is the only place that we've seen so far where there's a proper built floor inside of the Principia. All the other rooms have something different. A number of things pointed to some sacred activity, taking place here. Whether or not that was its exclusive function or sacred activity was taking place anywhere at different times is unclear. We had a couple of statue fragments, a couple of which may have been Roman imperial statues, perhaps Trajan, perhaps a piece of Hadrian, not exactly sure. We know that the Roman imperial cult was something that was practiced in the headquarters building, but what room outside of the Sacellum, which would be obvious, these things were taking place is not clear. Other things include these built bases here, of which if we switch over to here, we think we have 3 of them along this side. Could have been foundations for arches for a second floor or a possible bases for statues as well. In between, you can just make out that we have this nice plastered niche here, which may have been for statues as well. Moving to the next room, which is connected to it by 2 doorways in this direction. Here we also found a nice concrete floor, but inside a very large pile of building stones, apparently left in place after or as a result of the dismantling of the entire base. And in and among these building stones, a peculiar piece of statuary, which I have drawn in here. I'm coming to a photograph of it in just a moment, and we'll spend some time on it. Ah, here it is. Okay, so this thing in this pile of building stones, some of which you can still see in place here, which is a really nice piece. If any of you have been to the Israel Museum at any point in the last couple of years, you would have seen this piece on display. The famous bronze bust of Hadrian, which was found near Beit Shan, was on loan to France, I think, somewhere, maybe the Louvre. And so our little thingy, whatever it is, was put in its place, but it's now back in the storerooms. This is as we found it, and as we zoom in, you can see that it has some remarkable features. Here's our reconstruction of it, thanks to the Israel Museum's restoration lab. It's a stone platform with a stone column on top of it. Normally, when you see something similar to this, of this height, you would expect to see on top some sort of socket for receiving a statue on top of it to hold it in place, a metal socket maybe, or a bust or something like that. No such thing on top. It's perfectly clean. The base you see has these nice triangular diamond-shaped inlays. The inlay is of bitumen, which we think may have been sourced from Jordan near El Rasas perhaps, which itself has these marble inlays inside of it. It doesn't have any parallels, which is fun, so we were able to publish it and then say whatever we wanted about it, which I'll tell you about in just a second. Sorry. The bottom of this stone, which you see here is photographed, has this big X marked on it, and there were pieces of concrete still adhering to it. So we knew right away that this was somehow mounted somewhere else, and where I will come to in just a moment. Let's move on to room C. Zooming in here is a latrine, which is very nice to find. Everybody likes to find a latrine. It makes for great jokes for when you're doing site tours. It does happen to be, if you like statistics, the only latrine ever excavated inside of a Principia of a Roman legionary base of the Principate period. That's right. You can see it here. It has these beautiful tiles that all have markings of the 6th Legion on them, and these X's, which are done by a 4-finger X by the potter. What's missing here is the seat, so you're looking down into the sewer itself. The seat would have been in this emplacement here and stretched all the way across to this side. Based on the dimensions, I suspect this was a 2-seater. Very romantic. And this also has a unique feature of all of the latrines in the Roman world, this specialized flushing mechanism, which is a piece of water pipe which is inserted to the side of the thing and would have gone underneath the seat for presumably dumping water or other things. During the excavation of the sewage channel beneath, as you would probably expect, we found tons and tons and tons of garbage. In fact, we found more artifacts in this 1 meter by 1 meter by half a meter sewer than we did in all of the rest of the excavation. Of course, the sewers also were part of the garbage dump, so maybe that's what this was for instead of a flushing mechanism. I don't know. All right, so from the latrine, we go down to room D, which is a special room. Why? Go. It had a number of features which were peculiar. First of all, a strange water installation which shared water supply and sewage with the adjacent latrine here. So obviously we thought that that was just like where you wash your hands after you use the latrine. But on the other side of the room is this curious base here, which had on top of it a kind of X shape with pieces of concrete still wedged into it, and its width being the same width as the base of our little standing stone here. So we have reconstructed that our standing stone with its inlays sat on top of this block and therefore sat up against this south wall, this back wall, opposite to the water feature on the other side of the room. The water feature being right next to the only entrance and exit to the latrine. So one possibility is that this was for holding the toilet paper, I suppose. But nobody would let me put that in print. We did put something into print. You're welcome to look at it here. It's twice as long as it should be. The upshot is that we have found other examples in Roman legionary bases where weird standing stones that are otherwise inexplicable were found right next to water features. And in those cases, the other excavators, did I give an example here? Oh, here's an example from Palmyra. The standing stone and the water feature, which leads to a larger water tank next to it. There's also an example in Jordan at Humaima and at Palmyra as well, which are very similar. In those examples, the excavators thought that they may have been connected to, the ancient tradition of standing stone cults in the Near East, possibly in the manifestation of those standing stone cults that were inspired by Nabateans, who were in close connection with the Roman army at this time. Especially at Legio, we have several Nabatean names associated with Roman military officials from bread stamps and other things as well. I throw that out there, I don't know. Okay, now on to the Sakellum. Again, this is the place where the legionary standards were kept, where the imperial cult was based, and where the treasury of the legion was. So this is where we hope to find all the really cool stuff. Our GPR data, which you see here, oriented alongside and to relative scale with Lambesis, show this peculiar feature right at the central axis of the structure, which looks like a curving thing, right? Do you see it? Curving thing. Lambesis and some others, though not all Principia, had apses. Let's just go to this example. Had apses as part of the Sakellum. Lambesis has it, but this example from Bulgaria does not. It does have a projection. It is a rectangular projection in the back. That was sort of a starting point. We had hoped to find an apse, but we sort of did and sort of didn't, as we will see. Sorry, 1 minute. I want to make an aside here, if you don't mind. Lambesis was excavated in the 1880s, and the only publication of it is a really difficult French excavation report. Nothing against the French, of course, just this particular one. Of an excavation which was of an 1880s style of excavation. And this plan is the only plan that we have, and the verbal description of the Sakellum itself comprises about 2 sentences. So unless you go to visit the site, you have no idea really what this looks like, and you don't really know if you can trust this plan or not. I had a very cool opportunity. A friend of mine was going to Algeria for some reason or another, and it's very hard to get to Lambesis because it's all the way in the south in a secure area. So he went, and I asked him to take a bunch of photographs for me. And in fact, as you probably know, 3D modeling is all the rage in archaeology these days, and we do a lot of things with it. I asked him to take photographs in a certain way with just his iPhone or whatever phone he had, so that we could maybe build a 3-dimensional model of this thing and study it. Well, he did. He took the photos, went back to wherever he was, and he uploaded them to me. And within a few hours, I was able to create a 3D model of the Sakellum at Lambesis. And I'm telling you, oh, I have an example here. well, that looks ugly. It is ugly because it's completely overgrown and filled with garbage and things like that. But this angle isn't great. But what we were able to get out of it was an ortho photo of the Sakellum itself. And from this 3D model, we were able to see at least 3 or 4 architectural rebuildings of the structure. We got more stratigraphic and chronological information out of this 3D model made on an iPhone by a guy as he was passing by than we ever got from the original excavator. And we're writing a paper together about remote archaeology and the things that we learned from this particular building. Without going into all of them, of course, I already mentioned that we saw a lot of phasing already in this structure. We were able to tell something that was only mentioned as an aside in the original publication, that underneath the floor, here are the floor blocks here, were 5 underground secret passages. Here documented for the world for the first time, entered by a staircase in this direction. Based on other examples, we suspect that this is maybe where the treasury, the actual gold was kept, but in other examples where we have the horarium, the treasury underneath the floor of the building. It's usually just a small room that you can put a lockbox in. But here we have these 5 underground passages, which also have this curious feature. I think I have another cutaway of it. Yeah, here we go. This is now, I've cut off the top floor for you so you can see down into these 5 passages. See all the garbage inside? But they have these oculi, these holes in these 3 chambers, which have visual and presumably for air access to the main apse here. So this is all new information that was not included in the original report. So very exciting, and there's my 3D modeling pitch. So I think if everybody just makes a practice of 3D modeling, or at least taking the photos for every site that you ever visit, and just setting them aside, that archaeologists in the future will be very happy for you. Okay, back to our Sakellum. Here now, zooming in to it itself, you get a good sense of what it looks like. Again, like many of the other parts of the camp, it's heavily robbed out. We have a large pavement here. We have a rectangular, I know it's all in dotted lines here, but it's certain because a lot of this mess that is not so obvious to you here is part of the bedrock, which has been cut to form a back wall of this structure. And of course, we have this wall as it extends across the, to the other area and so forth. And it looks very similar to the Bulgarian example. But despite the fact that it does have this rectangular protrusion behind the base, it also seems to have an apse as well. If you look very carefully here, we have enough of the floor blocks to see a curve here before it gets to this funky thing, which I'll show you in a minute, and another curve off of this side. So it's an apse inside of a rectangular thing, which may have something to do with phases. Good. A little bit closer here now, you can see the basalt pavement that's in this shape here. The wall, of course, that makes the curve has been robbed away. And what's really funny and took us aback was that at the central axis of the room is this funny thing here, which is not an independent stone block. It's a piece of the bedrock that they left in place while they carved all around it and quarried away to create the rest of the structure. They left this in place. We were able to find one example of this in Roman cultic setting. Here it is here. Here's an example from Herculaneum of the Sacello de Augusti, in which the back wall of the shrine has an altar, the base of which is the native bedrock left in place protruding from the back. As it happens, this particular shrine is connected to the imperial cult, so that may be why we are seeing it in our Sakellum as well. It's a little bit more work to do on that. We also have this cut feature here, which we thought was going to lead to some secret underground chambers, but it didn't. It just led to more rock. But there is good reason to at least hypothesize there might be underground chambers nearby that were accessed from other parts of the excavation area, and we will be continuing that as well. They had to put the gold somewhere. Okay. A few finds from the Sakellum. Again, not very much, but some things that really get you excited, like bronze toes. That was disgusting. pieces of hair, and fragments of inscriptions here as well. We hoped for something big. As many of you may have noticed in a recent publication in Journal of Roman Archaeology, a very small and later Roman army base, cavalry base in particular, excavated Tel Shalem near Beit Shan. They also excavated the Sakellum just the summer before us, which made us a little bit angry. But there they found this amazing mosaic with blue colors and a dated inscription on it and all sorts of other historical information. So we just found some rocks, but that's okay. This is a nice rock. This is an Imperial Eagle. You can see it from a few views here. Here you see the wing coming back, and here's the front. Its head has been chopped off somehow, unfortunately. And this curious feature, and here I want to ask for any thoughts from the audience. This is an architectural block. It's about 1 meter by 1 meter, roughly. These two pieces go together, and together they form this decoration that has this kind of rhombus shape. I'll come to a reconstruction in a minute. A rhombus shape where each corner of the rhombus has these kind of like fang-like things. At the very center is a rosette. And the only example I could find that is similar is this example from the Louvre showing a temple door in the background that has this decoration, albeit without the fangs coming out of it. Here it is at the Israel Museum being put back together, and you can see how these fangs work. If anybody has any ideas, I'd love to hear them. We do know that in Roman cultic scenarios, and others as well, that like the temple at Baalbek, these beautiful ceiling blocks, which are huge blocks, had geometric designs on them, some of which would sort of look maybe reminiscent. But open to advice. Okay, with that, I'll bring you back to Armageddon. Because for years, during our excavations at Tel Megiddo, we've been selling the excavation to volunteers by saying, come and dig at Armageddon. And that really works. And Armageddon has always, at least in modern popular culture, at least since over the last 30 years, been associated with Megiddo. Well, it's called the Mount of Megiddo, after all. But we have a different idea now that I think is better connected to the base itself. As many of you probably know very well, even more than I do, the subtext of Revelation, once all of the theology is kind of stripped out, is more or less a military plan or political agenda for kicking the Romans and liberating Judea. And if we think strategically for a moment in the Roman world, from the Judean world, there have to be two military objectives to liberate Judea. The ultimate one is to kick out the 10th Legion in Jerusalem, but you can't get the 10th Legion until you get the only other legion that is stationed in the region at Legio. And so we believe, and we're working this up for publication, that it is Legio and specifically the presence of the Roman army here that has connected the apocryphal ideas here with the area of Megiddo. And by the 1st and 2nd century CE, the name Megiddo, we can show, had already been disconnected from the Tel itself. The only topographic use of Megiddo was referring to the valley, Deborah and the waters of Megiddo. The guy writing Deborah didn't know where Megiddo was. He was thinking of the entire valley as Megiddo and the waters rushing through it. And I suspect that the Mount of Megiddo was something similar. Whatever he was thinking in terms of actual topography, he didn't mean the Tel of Megiddo. In any case, this has some implications, because if you'll buy that story, then you automatically have to understand that at least this component of the book of Revelation cannot be part of the package until after the legion arrives there, no earlier than 117 CE. And many of you probably know that the text of Revelation is usually dated in composition to around 90 for very circumstantial reasons. So we might be able to push back that date by about 20 or 30 years eventually. Great, thank you.